Good morning. Will the noise from the left change the president's timeline as he tries to make good on promises to voters? Good morning, everyone. I'm Maria Bartiromo. Welcome to Sunday Morning Futures. 1 week from tomorrow, President Trump hands over his spending plan to lawmakers. In his new budget, he is calling for a $54 billion increase in defense spending. Is that enough? White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney joins us live momentarily. Then the president accuses former President Obama of tapping his phones before the election, comparing it to Watergate, demanding lawmakers investigate. We will talk to former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, as well as a member of the House Intel Committee here coming up. House lawmakers this week preparing to consider legislation on repealing and replacing Obamacare. But where is the plan? Congressman Mark Sanford on complaints from some conservatives. We're looking ahead right now on Sunday Morning Futures. And a major battle over the budget could be in the works. 1 week from tomorrow, President Trump will submit his budget plan to Congress. Lawmakers are already gearing up for a fight. Among the biggest issues, the president calling for a $54 billion increase in military spending. Some critics are already saying it's not enough. Others worried about a $20 trillion debt. Mick Mulvaney is the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and he joins me right now. Good to see you, sir. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning, Maria.
So obviously we invited you on the program so that we could talk about the budget and what to expect a week from tomorrow. But before I get to that, let me get your reaction on the story of the moment. Do we have evidence that the Obama administration made those requests to, in fact, tap the president?
Maria, I may be the exact wrong person to ask that question to. We've been literally knee-deep in numbers here at the OMB for the last couple of days. The office was full all day yesterday on Saturday. It's just here behind us. It's full today on Sunday. We're crunching numbers, and I have no information, no comment about anything other than the budget.
So all of this noise from the left, whether it's Russia, whether it's wiretapping, Senator Schumer calling the president's cabinet a swamp, has that slowed you down in terms of your timeline in getting the legislative priorities done? That is Obamacare, repeal and replace, tax reform, etc.
Yeah, not even Maxine Waters calling me a scumbag has slowed us down. No, we're actually working. We're here putting the president's policies into action every single day. Folks can pay attention to whatever they want to, but across the street at the Office of Management and Budget, we are working.
Wow. That's tough to swallow there. Okay, let's talk about this. Mick, we want to get your priorities down and have an understanding of what those priorities are. We know that defense spending is a priority. What can you tell us in terms of your priorities in that budget that we will hear about in a week?
Sure, that's easy. The priorities are exactly what the priorities that the president set out during the campaign. He said he wanted to spend more money on defense. He said he wanted to spend more money on immigration enforcement. Excuse me, it's really cold this morning. I apologize for being tongue-tied.
Not at all.
He said he wanted to spend more money on enforcing the laws that are already on the books. He said he wanted to spend more money on school choice. And he said he wanted to do that without adding any additional money to the deficit this year. And that's what we have been spending our time on. And that's what we'll be delivering next week.
All right. So $54 billion boost to defense spending is being talked about and debated on the left and on the right, Mick. And I want to get your take on this because I spoke with General Jack Keane, four-star general, just last week on Mornings with Maria on the Fox Business Network. And he had some stunning things to say about the readiness of our aircraft in the Navy as well as the Army, where the fleet is the oldest it's been in decades. And he questioned whether or not $54 billion is actually enough. Listen to General Jack Keane with me last week.
To give you a sense of how dramatic it is, 50 to 75% of our aircraft are not able to fly because of maintenance problems.
Wow.
Number two.
50 to 75%.
50 to 75%, depending on the service. The United States Army's ground forces, only 1/3 of their combat units are ready to fight today. Huh. That's the seriousness of the problem. And all the services are too small.
So, Mick Mulvaney, walk us through $54 billion in defense spending. Is that enough? And what do you say about the readiness of our military right now?
Sure, and I've seen the same data and heard the same things that the general mentioned. It does make one wonder what the Obama administration did with all the money that we spent on defense over the course of the last 8 years. But I will tell you this, Maria, in arriving at that $54 billion, there was a couple different things that got us to that number. First, It was the number that the president promised during the campaign. It is the number that would be for the military, $603 billion, if there were no military sequester. That was very specific. The president set out to undo the military sequester. That's exactly what this does. We sat down with the Defense Department, with the Pentagon, to go over how much money they actually needed to start solving some of these problems. We are not going to undo the damage that has been done in just 1 year. This is the first step of several years of additional defense spending this president wants to see. But again, we worked in close lockstep with the DOD to arrive at this number.
Okay, yeah. So continue, sir.
I'm just saying, and we managed to do so, and I don't want to minimize this at all. It would be easy to take any number out of the air, but it would inevitably add to the deficit this year. What I don't want to get lost in all of this is the president's commitment to move money within our current budgets to prioritize defense. He's doing this $54 billion of additional spending for the military without adding to the already large 2018 budget. That's exactly what he said he would do, and that's what he's delivering on.
So how important is it to you and your colleagues in terms of becoming revenue neutral? How important is it for you to raise revenue at a time when you are going to be cutting other things? For example, the cuts to domestic spending, where are they specifically?
Exactly where the president said they would be when he ran for office. We're moving money away from foreign aid. We're moving money away from duplicative programs, wasteful programs. We've identified a long list of programs at the OMB that we think just don't work. And that creates that source of funds that we can then move over to defense, to border enforcement, to educational choice, and again, accomplish exactly what the president said he would do when he campaigned.
Now, I want to read you a statement from the Committee for a Responsible Budget, and this, of course, is Maya McGinnis's group, and she says domestic discretionary spending, what the administration proposed to cut to pay for the increase in defense, only accounts for 15% of spending and less than 5% of spending growth over the next decade. It's really Social Security and health spending, on the other hand, accounting for half of total spending and almost 2/3 of spending growth over the next decade. This is not different than what you've been saying, that we need to take an axe to the entitlement programs. Any opportunity to do that in this budget?
Sure, and I have a lot of respect for that organization. I think what Ms. McGinnis misses is that this is a budget blueprint, not a full budget. The full budget won't be here until May. That's where we deal with things like policy changes, revenue streams. We'll look at entitlement spending. That's what most people think is the larger budget. What we'll be introducing on March 16th is simply the discretionary spending budget. We are not balancing the budget on the backs of the State Department. It's physically impossible to do. What we've done is moved money from foreign aid to defense so that we can prioritize that spending without adding to the deficit. When we get to that larger budget in May, that's when we get a chance to talk about those larger issues.
I see. All right. So talk to us about what we should expect then, because in terms of revenue and raising revenue while also cutting spending, you're cutting some domestic programs, you're cutting taxes. We had Steven Mnuchin on this program, the Treasury Secretary, last weekend, and basically he walked through some ideas with us about raising revenue while also cutting taxes. We know that you want to cut taxes for most Americans. So do you want to see a border adjustment tax? Here's what Steven Mnuchin told us in terms of a border adjustment tax or a so-called reciprocal tax and raising $1.1 trillion in revenue over a 10-year period. Watch this.
An idea that he's looking at calling a reciprocal tax, which is basically saying we want to create a level playing field so that other countries treat us the way we're treating them. We're not going to get into trade wars, but what we are going to do is the president believes in free trade, but he believes in fair trade.
What about that, Mick Mulvaney, in terms of the revenue raise? Are you married to also raising revenue while cutting taxes?
I think Mr. Mnuchin is spot on. I think what you heard him say, or if you dig down deeper into the details, the House likes a border adjustment tax, the Senate doesn't. We're looking at a couple of different ways to try and raise revenue, but also level the playing field. That will come as part of the larger tax reform discussion that will take place in the next couple of weeks. Keep in mind the batting order here, Maria. We think we'll have to see a discussion and a vote on Obamacare replacement first. Then you'll have a tax reform proposal a few weeks after that. Okay,
so just to be clear, we are looking at priorities in this upcoming budget of defense spending, of infrastructure spending, correct? What are the other spending priorities?
Actually, infrastructure will probably come as large of a part of a larger package later on in the summertime. The priorities in this budget are defense, homeland security, law enforcement. You'll see an increase to the proposed budget for the Department of Justice to enforce the laws that are already on the books. And then also things like school choice within the Department of Education. Those were the priorities for the president during the campaign. They'll be the priorities for the president in this budget.
And you're comfortable with an increase of $54 billion in defense, despite what we heard from General Jack Keane. You believe that America is safe with those kinds of numbers in the face of a potential attack or anything else?
I do. I believe that takes the important first steps to undo the damage that was done during the sequester and puts the military on a solid footing to be able to do what we need it to do.
And the priorities are that you'd like to get tax reform out by August. Is that correct?
Actually, I think tax reform is before that. The order, as I understand it, Maria, given the rules on Capitol Hill, are that Obamacare repeal and replace has to go first. Then we'll move into a discussion about tax reform. Then we'll have a discussion about infrastructure packages.
In terms of that budget, defense spending, is that the biggest allocator in terms of increases in spending?
Oh, sure, and it usually is. That the defense budget takes up about half of the discretionary budget. Remember, we could probably do an hour on the arcane nature of federal budgeting, but we actually only budget about a quarter of what we spend. We spend about $4 trillion, but 3/4 of that is what we call mandatory spending on the big entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, et cetera. The discretionary budget, about $1 trillion, or a quarter of what we spend, is what we actually budget through out of the White House, through the House and the Senate.
Mick Mulvaney, thanks so much for walking it through with us. We will be watching for the budget on March 16th. Thanks, sir.
Maria, next time let's do it in the studio, can we?
I'd love that. You'll come in and we'll be face to face. That'll be great. Mick Mulvaney, good to see you, sir. Have a good Sunday. We'll be watching. The White House now demanding action, meanwhile, after President Trump's explosive claims. Former President Obama bugged Trump Tower before the election. I'll be talking to former House Speaker Newt Gingrich about that, as well as Congressman Peter King on the Intel Committee. Follow us on Twitter at Maria Bartiromo, at Sunday Futures. Let us know what you'd like to hear from our upcoming guests, and stay with us. We're looking ahead right now on Sunday Morning Futures. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The White House now demanding action after President Trump accused former President Obama of wiretapping Trump Tower before the election. A White House statement says this, quote, reports concerning potentially politically motivated investigations immediately ahead of the 2016 election are very troubling. President Donald J. Trump is requesting that as part of their investigation into Russian activity, the Congressional Intelligence Committees exercise their oversight authority to determine whether executive branch investigative powers were abused in 2016. Joining me right now is Fox News contributor and former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker, always a pleasure. Good to see you.
Good to be with you.
What do you make of the situation this morning, developing as we speak?
Well, I would say to everybody that if you want a sophisticated analysis, go to Andy McCarthy's new column on this very topic. McCarthy was the prosecutor in 1993 who convicted the terrorist who bombed the original World Trade Center bombing back in 93. He's had a 20-year experience looking at these things, does so as having been a professional Justice Department prosecutor. He thinks there's a lot here. He thinks that there are some very troubling things about how the executive branch under President Obama behaved, and he thinks it's absolutely worth digging out and understanding what went on. And he points out that it's very unlikely that the FBI happened to go in October to ask for wiretap and got it from the FISA court with nobody in the Obama White House knowing they were doing it. I mean, to get a wiretap that included a presidential campaign in the last weeks of the campaign is a pretty extraordinary request. And that's McCarthy's point, that to think this happened to be done by some bureaucrats with no supervision, when you know, for example, that the Attorney General spent an hour in secret with Bill Clinton just before they dropped charges against his wife. And all this stuff smells to high heaven, despite the best efforts of the elite media to cover it up.
Well, I mean, what about that? You just heard Mark Levin's commentary on this. Mark Levin was on Fox and Friends going through points of evidence that showed that the Obama administration did, in fact, make 2 requests to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISA, and the first one was denied, but then the second one was accepted. It sure looks like maybe look, the White House, the Obama White House, rather, has put out this statement basically saying, trying to distance themselves from this entire story, that they did not order any of this surveillance. But we know that there were requests to put in a wiretap at Trump Tower.
Right. So when you look at it, and this is the point that Andy McCarthy makes this morning, you look at all this stuff, and you notice how carefully they worded. They didn't order it, okay? Did they know about it? Did they approve it? Did they allow the FBI to do it? And you have to ask yourself the question, what did they think? Remember, the only person who's ever been in the Trump official campaign who has ever been in any way involved about all this is Paul Manafort, and that was because of his Ukrainian ties, not Russia. And Paul had been gone for months, and Paul's a good guy. I'm not alleging anything with Paul, but he'd been gone for months. So what's their case? I mean, what the devil are they trying to do in this circumstance?
Right. Well, we still don't know what exactly they're suggesting. I mean, in any event, I mean, people have meetings with ambassadors and senators all the time, but we still don't understand what they're trying to charge in terms of these Russian meetings. But look at what John Favreau, who was a speechwriter for President Obama, points out, and he basically says, I would be careful about reporting that Obama said there was no wiretapping. The statement that the Obama White House released was that neither he nor the White House actually ordered it. So we are parsing words a bit here, aren't we?
Well, and it's very funny if you think about it, because you have this circumstance. If the New York Times had any hope of ever being neutral, one of the things they could do is simply print all of the pictures of all the Democrats meeting with the Russian ambassador. Because you have this whole series of people who are shocked that Senator Sessions, as a senator, met with the Russian ambassador. And then you began to get, Nancy Pelosi was meeting with the Russian ambassador. Claire McCaskill, senator from Missouri, was meeting with the Russian ambassador.
Right.
I mean, all these things began to come out, and you begin to realize this is an absurdity.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things we have to recognize, and I keep trying, frankly, to say this to the Trump team over and over again. They have a group of people who are their mortal enemies. The New York Times is one of them.
Right.
The Post is one of them. These folks are going to be against them every day. They're going to attack them every day. And they have to understand that they're living in a hostile environment.
Yeah, well, we're just trying to figure out if there was actually illegality done. I mean, Corey Lewandowski told Judge Jeanine last night that then Senator Jeff Sessions was also wiretapped, and they were bugging his conversations as well.
Well, let me just say,
real quick,
if they were actually wiretapping a United States senator, that is a very serious problem.
Yeah.
Whether it's legal or illegal, it is so dangerous to our freedoms, no matter who the senator is, that we'd have to understand it.
All right, we will leave it there. Great to see you, Newt. Thanks so much, Newt Gingrich. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. GOP lawmakers saying that House committees will start considering a plan to repeal and replace Obamacare this upcoming week. Republicans are hoping to have legislation on the president's desk by Easter. Congressman Mark Sanford is member of the House Oversight and House Budget Committees. He's also a member of the House Freedom Caucus. And, sir, it is good to have you back on the program. Welcome.
My pleasure. Thank you.
What is your expectation in terms of the rollout of the repeal and replace on timeline?
I think what you just described is it. I mean, I think that this is coming. We're going to mark up this week, I think, at the Ways and Means Committee level and Energy Commerce. And then, again, I think the Easter timeline holds. The more delicate part will be the replace, and there's still a bit of a tug-of-war going on as to exactly what that's going to look like. Yeah,
and unfortunately, the tug-of-war seems to be happening within the GOP. So you've got Rand Paul's plan, Susan Collins' plan. Which plan is most of the membership getting behind?
Well, you're mentioning the Senate versions of the plans. We have House companion plans. I have the companion plan to what Senator Paul has proposed on the Senate side. And, anyway, we won't go through all the plans, but there are a bunch of them. You have RSC, you have Phil Rowe, you have leadership.
But that's the point, sir.
I think it's going to be amalgamation.
Yeah. How are you going to come to a decision on what is the most viable? What are you arguing about in terms of the differences in the plans?
I would say the biggest pivot point at this point is on the notion of refundable tax credits versus not. The leadership plan, what we know about it at this point, includes refundable tax credits. The plan, for instance, that I've introduced with Senator Paul does not. I think that that's a pretty big divide. If you looked at, for instance, the earned income tax credit, there are about 25 million people that basically get a check. If you did this with health care, we're looking at maybe between 40 and 50 million people getting a check. Given what we've seen with the earned income tax credit, the amount of fraud, waste, and abuse, if you want to call it that has existed with that program, I think it's problematic in this case to give people a check.
And people are looking at that and saying that's Obamacare light. That's the same thing that Obamacare has, although you're calling it tax credits.
Yeah, it's a different version, different side of the same coin, and that's why I think there is a big divide between, in essence, the conservative camp within the caucus saying we feel uncomfortable at this point with the idea of a refundable tax credit, and other folks saying, wait a minute, this is a way of funding an HSA, a health savings account, that would be applicable to everybody, regardless of whether or not you have a tax liability.
People are wondering if, in fact, there's enough transparency on this whole process. Of course, we saw Senator Rand Paul last week carrying around a copying machine around the Capitol, basically making the point that how come the plan is not being discussed in terms of the specifics. Nancy Pelosi told us a long time ago, let's get the plan out and then we could read it later. He wants to make sure Americans understand what this is before it becoming law. Listen to what Rand Paul said last week.
I'm part of the legislature. Shouldn't I be part of the process? I was elected to represent my state, and I'm not allowed to read the working product so I can comment on it?
Why not put it all out there?
I think it will be put out there. And I don't think there's a great conspiracy here. I mean, typically we get a bill to review as it's about a couple days from what they call markup, which is the committee level. You're generally not going to get a bill before that. So I think that this is consistent with what we've seen with other bills. I think the difference here is, given what Nancy Pelosi said in the past, given people feel burned about this notion of vote on it and then you can read it, what the Speaker has said is, I promise full transparency in this process. We're going to have it out there. It's going to be a bottom-up process. In fairness to leadership, we had 4 meetings alone on health care just this last week, and that's at the full Republican caucus level. But what you have here again is folks saying, wait a minute, I want the more full, more robust version of transparency. But I think this is sort of again, a meeting in the middle. This is what typically happens with a bill that's about to be marked up. If we don't get it after markup, then we got a problem. But I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves in terms of pushing for a full drop of a bill that hadn't been created at the committee level yet.
All right, Congressman, we'll be watching for that markup next couple of weeks. Thanks very much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
We'll see you soon. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, meanwhile, already refocusing himself from investigations into alleged ties between Russia and the Trump campaign. But that is not enough for the left. Some calling for an independent counsel. Up next, why one former special prosecutor says that will never happen. We're looking ahead on Sunday Morning Futures, talking with Peter King coming up next. Stay with us. Welcome back. The White House now asking Congress to investigate the Obama administration for allegedly wiretapping Trump Tower right before the election. Congressman Peter King of New York sits on the House Homeland Security and Intelligence Committees. And Congressman, it is wonderful to see you. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Maria.
Should there be an investigation?
Yes, and right now the Intelligence Committee, which has been investigating this entire matter as far as Russian influence, I know the chairman, Devin Nunes, is asked to meet with the FBI Director Comey, and then as he goes along with all the people involved in the intelligence community to find out what happened here, to find out, again, the extent of any investigation, what the basis of it was. But one thing, Maria, I really want to emphasize at the start, before I get myself sidetracked at all, is that everything we know is that all the investigations that have gone on, there's not one piece of evidence connecting anyone in the Trump campaign with any collusion or collaboration with Russian intelligence, with the Russian government, or any criminal action whatsoever. And that is really important to get out there. Despite the headlines in the New York Times, buried in those stories, you'll always find something saying that so far there's no evidence. There is no evidence. Now, there may end up being evidence, but as of now, there's none. And there's a real question of who is leaking out these secret investigations to the New York Times, who is leaking out information from the intelligence community, all of which has a grain of truth.
Right.
But then when you get to the bottom line, it's totally exaggerated. And so the Times will go with headlines about connections between intelligence agents and the Trump campaign, and then you see the number 2 person in the FBI going to the White House and saying this is all BS.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I remember when this Russia narrative started, it was at the Democratic National Convention back last summer when Debbie Wasserman Schultz was pushed out because of all of her emails trying to take down Bernie Sanders. We were only talking about Debbie Wasserman Schultz for like 15 minutes, and all of a sudden the conversation changes to Russia, and they've just been riding that wave, and the media is very happy to go along with it, even though there's no evidence of any of this. But let me ask you this, Congressman, because we now understand that the Obama administration did make requests to the Foreign Intelligence courts, FISA, to actually bug Trump Tower. What can you tell us about that?
Well, again, I can't comment on that being on the Intelligence Committee. I will say I have tremendous faith in Director Comey. What happened with the Justice Department and why this was done, all this has to be looked into very carefully. And if for some reason there was a purpose, which would not necessarily involve Donald Trump or anything else, but there's some reason why that wiretap had to be put on, why an investigation had to be launched, then that should have been kept in the utmost secrecy, never to see the light of day unless something came of it. Obviously, nothing has come of it, and now it's being leaked out, and that to me is absolutely disgraceful.
In fact, it's more than just the president. Corey Lewandowski told Judge Janine last night that, in fact, then Senator Jeff Sessions was also being tapped. Listen to this.
What we've seen from the previous administration is that they did spend time listening to conversations between then Senator Jeff Sessions and the ambassador to Russia while he was in his U.S. Senate office. If that were to take place, which supposedly did take place, what other conversations did they listen in on?
Do you expect that this investigation will include the Obama administration tapping the Trump administration?
I think it has to include the whole spectrum here as to how much was legitimate, how much was political, if any, and also how this information was maintained and protected. Because if you're going to be involved in any investigation of a candidate for president and nothing comes from that, that has to be inviolate. No one should ever see that. And that is, the fact is being leaked out. It's almost like there's an alternative government. There's people starting back in December when somebody in the intelligence community started leaking out about Russia. Then the thing about a dossier when only 4 people were in the room, that leaked out. That's leak after leak. This is, in many cases, criminal. General Flynn, that conversation with the Russian ambassador, that was a crime, whoever leaked that. A serious crime.
Congressman, before you go, real quick, I wanted to switch conversations on you, given you are a member of the Homeland Security Committee. We're expecting the president to come out with a new executive order as early as Tuesday this week in terms of that travel ban. How will it look different?
I think it's going to be more specific, more refined. It's probably going to allow for people with visas and green cards to come in to the U.S. There's some talk, I'm not sure whether or not Iraq will still be on the list, and it's probably not going to target Syria, but it's going to basically apply to all refugees, not just Syria. Listen, I was fine with the first executive order, but if this is what it takes, let's get it done because I think it's important.
All right, we'll leave it there. Congressman Peter King, always a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks so much, sir.
Thank you, Maria.
All right, we'll see you soon. Meanwhile, Attorney General Jeff Sessions recusing himself from any investigations of alleged ties between the Russians and the Trump campaign after meetings between Sessions and the Russian ambassador to the U.S. were revealed. Some Democrats, though, want to go even further and get an independent counsel. Joining me right now to explain why in this Sunday Morning Futures exclusive, Robert Ray is with me, former Whitewater independent counsel and former federal prosecutor, and it is good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Maria.
Is that what we need here, an independent counsel?
I don't think so. I mean, it sounds like this is a political issue. And I think the first question is, unless there were evidence of collusion or promises made during the campaign or in the transition with regard to Russian officials, what is exactly would a prosecutor be investigating? Now, there are intelligence matters to be addressed. That should be handled by the political branches. It ought to be handled by Congress, but not by a special counsel.
You know, it's really interesting because here we are talking about the potential for President Obama to have tapped President Trump's phones. And, you know, the media wants all these questions about it, and they want, you know, more specific evidence about it. And yet when referring to the Russian story, We don't have any evidence that, in fact, there was any collusion or there was any interaction whatsoever between the Trump administration and Russian operatives. And yet it's as if it's commonplace, the way you see it on television and in the papers.
Well, prosecutors aren't fact gatherers. They gather facts and investigate in order to decide whether or not crimes have been committed. And that's why, while an investigation is appropriate, that's something appropriately handled by Congress in the first instance. You don't talk about a special counsel or appointing, extraordinary measures. And certainly in this instance, there's no reason to think that the Justice Department can't adequately address this if questions regarding the commission of crime are raised. But only in the exceptional or extraordinary case would you be calling for a special counsel. The Department of Justice is perfectly capable of handling this, even though the Attorney General has recused.
Well, this is serious stuff. I mean, the president came out yesterday and said, wow, just learned that President Obama was actually tapping my phones at Trump Tower. What did you make of that tweet?
I take that seriously. The president is the chief executive. He is the executive branch. If anybody is in a position to know, President Trump would know.
So, in other words, he said, and then Sean Spicer said, look, we have nothing else to say about this. We're not going to comment further until we actually see an investigation that includes looking at this potential tapping.
Because it's an intelligence matter. And as Congressman King explained, I mean, it's a rather extraordinary thing for that to be dumped into the public domain.
What would you like to see happen now in terms of getting to the bottom of some of these claims?
I think it's for Congress to decide. I mean, that's where the people's representatives are. They should investigate. The calls for a special counsel, frankly, are overstated, and this got all wrapped around the axle with regard to the recusal of the Attorney General. And as your lead-in pointed out, who cares whether there were meetings with Russian officials? That's not the issue. We get to the question of whether crimes were committed only if there's evidence to suggest that there was collusion, complicity, or promises made during the campaign or the transition. Absent such evidence, while there are legitimate intelligence questions to be addressed, and the Congress can address them, there's no need for calling a special counsel under these circumstances.
And what did you think of President Obama's answer? His spokesperson saying we didn't order it.
Well, he doesn't order it. The court orders it.
Right, so there's parsing words.
But the court doesn't order stuff in a vacuum. The court only orders stuff because the executive branch goes and applies for a warrant.
Right. There you go. Thank you very much for that. We appreciate your time this morning.
Thanks,
Robert.
Maria.
Thank you very much. Welcome back. President Trump expected to sign a brand new executive order this upcoming week on immigration. We're expecting this by Tuesday. The new measure following an earlier order Mr. Trump signed in late January. An appeals court, of course, later blocked that one. I want to bring in our panel right now. Tony Sayegh is a Republican political analyst, the executive vice president of Jamestown Associates, and a Fox News contributor. Stephen Sigmund is the senior vice president of Global Strategy Group and a Democratic strategist. And Lee Carter is president and a partner at Maslansky and Partners. Good to see everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Let's talk about the executive order for a moment. We're expecting it this upcoming week. What do we need to see to feel like it's not going to get blocked again, Tony?
Well, the reality is, Maria, I get the sense that the opposition to this, even partly in the courts, is so political. When you look at the Ninth Circuit, for example, they went well outside the usual criteria for making a ruling, and they cited to rule against this order things that Donald Trump said on the campaign trail, things Rudy Giuliani as a surrogate said on the campaign trail.
That's right.
They didn't base it on actual legal precedent and statute. And we know, both through Supreme Court cases in the past and the U.S. Code, the president has the authority when it comes to immigration, when it comes to national security, and he will make, I have no doubt, an executive order that will ultimately sustain the judicial requirements, but the political one, I don't know how quickly that disappears.
Yes, Stephen, we're expecting that Iraq is not on that list of 7 countries in this new executive order, and we're expecting that the refugee point is going to be much broader than just from Syria.
Look, I think the problem with the order in the first place was that it was a mess, right? And it was a political mess. I don't know about the constitutionality of it. I'm not a lawyer, although it has been blocked constitutionally so far. But the reason that it backfired on them politically is because of the stories behind it, right? The stories of actual people who this affected. I happened to have a dinner last night with Syrian refugees and others, one of whom who told me that he spoke good English, that he had built a business of 150 people over 25 years, and he had to flee Syria has spent 25 days on the streets in New York City and spent 2 years getting his family here because they are vetted, and now he's washing dishes. I mean, those are the kind of stories that you're talking about.
Is he legal right now?
Yeah, I mean, he's a and
he's an American citizen now.
And he no, he's here on a political asylum. He's a Syrian refugee, and he would be the kind of person who would be blocked. And if you're talking about, you know, you're poor who are yearning and you're tired or yearning to be free, these are those people, and that's what we saw during the ban, and that's why it backfired politically.
I just want to make sure that we're not confusing legal versus illegal, because that's what's been happening lately. It feels like there's a lot of confusion
I get
about
it, but
what's
he's
legal
exactly
and what's illegal.
who would be blocked under this ban.
But I think we've got to be really, really clear here. To me, this has been a complete failure of communication, because what's been happened is that the ban went out and it became a Muslim ban. It became a travel ban. It became nothing that it was intended to do. It was 90 days that we were going to reevaluate how we were going to vet people coming into this country, and we were going to make sure that we're going to be doing so in a right way. And what Donald Trump even said himself, he said this was a communication failure more than a political failure. Right. And what he needed to do this time, I think, is really get the communication set up right so he could see these are principles we can all agree on. We want people to come here legally. We want people to be able to come here safely.
You know what's been grossly missing from this conversation is the idea that the American people actually do support the macro effort of President Trump and what he's trying to accomplish with this immigration executive order, which, to Lee's point, is for a temporary period where we enhance our vetting and tracking of people who come from failed states in which we have no strong bilateral or intelligence relationship with.
That's not what this ban did, right? Because the ban unfairly targeted just 7 countries and maybe just 6 in this case, and didn't target the countries that actually have had experience sending people here who committed terrorist acts.
The list came from the Obama administration, though, right?
Correct. And we also had the 7 came from the Obama administration, but we have relationships with the Saudis. We have relationships with the Pakistanis that allow us to work with their intelligence agencies and their governments to improve the vetting process. We don't have that with the Sudan. We don't have that with Iran and Somalia and the others that were on this list. But to your point, Maria, was established during the Obama administration.
But I think it's true that Americans support the notion of having a better vetting to have safety, right? The problem is you have a fairness problem here, right? You want to they support doing that across the board, not targeting specific places and specific people.
But what we know is that ISIS has made very strong claims that they're going to infiltrate the Syrian refugee program to the point where they want to import their terrorism through such programs.
They said they have a passport machine. They have a passport-making machine. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we want to get back to also President Trump demanding Congress investigate alleged wiretapping at Trump Tower by the Obama administration. Where does that go from here? Our panel's going to weigh in on that. We're looking ahead right now on Sunday Morning Futures. Back in a moment. Welcome back. We go back to our top story right now. The White House alleging President Obama bugged Trump Tower right before the election. We're back with our panel. This is an incredibly explosive charge, and we know that the Obama administration, Tony Sayegh, did request wiretapping, but the first request was denied.
Correct, Maria, and I think the response to this charge from the Obama camp tells a very important story that we need to pursue a little bit deeper here. While they deny that the president himself or a White House official ordered this, it's abundantly clear and substantiated in many media publications since that there was a FISA application in June that was denied. It was retailored in October. It was granted. It dealt with Trump associates, potentially other campaign operatives as well, during the course of the campaign, and it likely came from the Justice Department, which is under the jurisdiction of the president, the executive branch. So you have a very precarious situation where I think the president does not want to make a categorical denial, because the truth is, the deeper you investigate this, the more likely it does become that there was some sort of approved surveillance of the Trump campaign.
The first request, and that's FISA, that's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Stephen, that was denied, the first one, but the second one was approved, that they could wiretap him.
I believe so, but look, that's the point. It would have had to have been approved by a court, and they would have had to have got a warrant for it. It's not the president saying, go wiretap Donald Trump. It's something very different, and there would have had to have been some reason for it, right?
Very different, meaning it's just go wiretap his people.
Correct. It's not the president of the United States in a Nixonian way saying put bugs in Trump Tower. It's a court of law approving a warrant, if in fact that happened.
But the application has to be requested and made from his Department of Justice.
Sure it does, but there's still a court that has to approve it.
You know what? The question of whether or not all of this, whether it's this Russian narrative that's been going on since the Democratic National Convention or anything else, is this going to slow down the Trump administration priorities, the legislative agenda, repeal and replace, tax reform?
But clearly it's a distraction, right? I mean, we're all talking about this, and we're not talking about tax reform. Is it happening in August? Is it not? Now we're talking about.
Well, Stephen Mnuchin's talking about tax reform, and Mick Mulvaney's talking about tax reform.
But there's a lot of people now focused on this nefarious Russia that most people don't even know what they're talking about. When I talk to voters out there, and you're talking about Trump is in Russia, you know, Russia influenced the election, Trump, Russia, all of this. Nobody knows what they're talking about. It's just a bad, negative halo that people are feeling.
And now, the media's riding with it.
And I've got to say before. Is that Donald Trump has a very clear strategy here. He says everybody's saying this is nefarious. I'm going to fight back. I'm calling your bluff, and I'm putting it right back there. And that is what he does.
That the president steps on the messages that you're talking about. I mean, he gave, this is the third time in a row, he's given a good message-driven speech and then kind of set it on fire by tweeting about something completely different.
The liberals have weaponized this unsubstantiated Russian claim as an obstructionist tool.
Yeah.
And it could work potentially, but it hasn't worked up until now.
The one thing to watch next, back in a moment.